Hi, good afternoon. My name is David Knight. How many of you have ever been on a job site before where someone has injured themselves to the point you've had bleeding control first aid to render? Whether you've done it or you've just been on a job where it's happened. Obviously, I am expecting Tim and Steve to raise their hands, but a number of you as well. The good news, Jeff, they did not run out of ink. Nobody's brought in a new case of pens, so I think we're in good shape. I don't want to beat a dead horse with this, and everybody's talked about it, but I am going to remind you that scene safety is really important. One of the first points brought up to us was, as a first aid provider, we are the single most important person on the job site. Andy, or Jeff, or Gabe, as a first aid provider, you are the single most important person on that job site. A dead rescuer is not a rescuer. They're simply dead. So it's important, as we approach the scene, that we evaluate it. We've all talked about the energized electrical equipment and the collapse hazards and other things, but think about where the patient is, because most of us are going to be on a construction site. And the hazards that aren't necessarily hazards in our mind. I've got a person who's injured I'm rendering first aid to, and we're on an unprotected or leading edge, and I go 2 steps the wrong direction, and overboard I go. Scene safety is critical because as first aid providers, we are the most important person on that job site. Doing first aid, you will come across a variety of injuries, from splinters to simple lacerations and abrasions, to more complicated and bleeding lacerations, perhaps partial or even full amputations, crush injuries, major traumatic injuries. Keep in mind that your course of action as a first aid provider always must fall within the scope of practice for basic first aid. As you are called to a location, a couple of thoughts that should be going through your mind. The first one is matching your dressings to the injury. This great big trauma pad, not a whole lot of good for a splinter. Would you agree? Right. On the other hand, a few 3x3s and some Band-Aids, not much use for an amputated set of fingers. So we've got to be able to match everything. Also on your way, you want to make sure you get your gloves on, your personal protective equipment. You've got gloves. We're on a construction site. We're probably wearing eyeglasses. Why is personal protective equipment so important?
Protect yourself.
And why, Jeremy?
So that you don't catch something from the patient.
So you don't get something, so you don't get sick. And just a reminder, because as the first aid provider, you are the most important person on that job site. I do want to warn you before you get there. Page 17, there are some graphic photos. We're going to skip past those. We're going to page 18. There's a skill sheet in there that we're going to kind of follow along with. Right? The first step that we want to do is apply direct pressure. Now, as he's walking up to us, you've got to ask, is the scene safe? It appears to be. Steve, what happened? Take your hand, if you would. Put some pressure on there.
I fell down and go boom.
Steve fell down and went boom. Right? First thing, after we've assessed that the scene is safe, we want to call for some help. Get a coworker at a minimum. Joe, Steve's been hurt. I need you to give me a hand.
You need me to call 911?
We're going to get some gloves on. I want to get some dressings. Let's see what's going on here first, Joe. Take these and put them on your cut, if you would. We're going to get some gloves on. You notice, lay them flat, and I want you to apply direct pressure. Squeeze it nice and hard. Step 2 goes through the dressings. Step 3 walks you into direct pressure. Now let's keep in mind, you may be holding direct pressure for about 10 minutes. You may need to go to donut bandages. You're not going to want to apply direct pressure on a head injury where we suspect a skull fracture. Not going to want to apply direct pressure over impaled objects. Not going to want to apply direct pressure over open fractures. Here's a donut bandage. Quick show of hands. Glazed. Where's jelly? Jelly.
Come on, Krispy Kreme.
I'm lemon myself. we've got direct pressure on. I've got my gloves on. I'm holding direct pressure. You're going to want to check the injury. If this is bleeding through, you'll keep your dirty hands down to the side, thank you. If this starts to bleed through, we're going to need some more dressings. Real critical at this point that we add, don't take these away. Joe, could I get some more dressings from you? There should be a trauma pad over there. That's perfect, thank you. Why don't we want to take this initial layer off?
Because you're trying to get it coagulated.
We're trying to get it to clot. If we take that initial layer off, we pull the clots right out of there. Now we've got fresh bleeding going on. Also keep in mind with direct pressure, we may get such a bulk of dressings on here that we can't compress anything. That's going to create a problem. So we need to get rid of extra stuff, but still maintain that initial layer in there. We fast forward several minutes and we've got a dressing that has actually clotted, so we've got the bleeding stopped. Joe, can I get that large roll of bandage on there? You'll notice I'm having Joe give me a hand who's got clean hands. Bloodborne pathogens, we don't want to contaminate our box. Joe, could you give me a hand here?
Sure, I'm gonna put some gloves on.
You would, just step over to the side there, put some direct pressure on. As I start to bandage, I've got nice rolls of material. I want to pull out several inches. And could I ask you two to turn this way just so everybody could see? That's perfect. I want to reach under Steve's arm. And you'll notice I've got 4 to maybe 6 inches past here. This has a little bit of stretch. It's important that we have a restrictive compression, but not restrictive type of bandage on here. So I'm going to bring this up. I'm going to pull this towards me. And I'm going to immediately capture it. This is what's called an anchor wrap. I'm going to go nice single wrap all the way up and around. We're going to go from below the bandage to above the bandage, and I have a very nice even layer on. As I continue to bandage now, and we come back on top of the wound, I'm going to place some half twists right over top of the bandage. Any idea what this half twist does for us? It's going to add just a bit of direct pressure for us. Again, we don't want anything restrictive, but it's going to work quite nicely. As I come to the end here, you'll notice I've got maybe 1.5 feet of material. I'm going to make the rabbit's ear. I'm going to bring this under, and now imagine tying your shoes. Everybody see the 2 different loops, the tails here? We're going to tie a half hitch and another half hitch. Now, depending on how you've tied this, you've either ended up with a double half hitch or a square knot if you were a Boy Scout. Joe, thank you for your help. Steve, if you would, please show your wound to everybody. Now, there are 3 other things that need to be checked once we've completed this, which Dave actually just alluded to. The first one, over here, Steve, if you would. Can you wiggle your fingers for me? The injured hand. Motor function is intact. He's still able to move everything. Can you tell which finger I'm touching? I'm not touching this.
Middle finger.
Verbalize for me, okay?
Pointy.
Index finger. So he's got good sensory function. The other thing I want to check is capillary refill. We'll squeeze the nail bed, and every one of you can check this on yourself. Squeeze your nails up against your thumb. What color do they go, Jeremy?
White-ish.
What about yours, Ted?
White.
Whitish? Brian?
Green.
Girl, we got a problem. Let's call 911. Martians, aliens amongst us. What this does is it squeezes the blood out. It checks capillary refill, which is a good indicator of blood pressure and circulation. When you let go, it goes right back to red. With him, I have checked motor function, sensory function, as well as circulation. He's in good shape. EMS has arrived. We're going to send him on his way, but going to the hospital with him will be all of our blood-soaked dressings, bandages, gloves, trash. It's a health hazard, medical waste issue on our site. We need to send it along with him. Okay? Thank you, Steve. There are a few other considerations for you as well when it comes to bleeding control. 3 things I'm going to mention to you. I want to stress that these are all within the scope of practice for a first aid provider. First one would be wound packing. When you have a bleeding wound in an extremity and direct pressure isn't working, you can take some gauze, wrap around the finger, actually shove in there and locate that bleeder. get some direct pressure up against there, hold it in nice and tight. We'll take some more and we change fingers, one goes in, one comes out. We've got more dressing in there, pack it in there nice and tight. We're not stuffing a turkey. We're getting in against a bleeder. Now, if that makes you queasy, don't do it. Second one will be tourniquets. Tourniquets are for extremities only. They're not for the scalp wound on your uncompromising superintendent. Lastly, hemostatic agents. These are dressings, gauze-based dressings that have clot factor enhancers on them. Clay-based, seashell-based. Again, all three of these within the scope of a practitioner of basic first aid. However, they all require some additional training. On bleeding control, what questions do you have that I can answer for you? Nothing? Are you certain?